welcome you all, those who are already in attendance, and we'll take a couple of minutes for this introduction to let people wander in if they're slightly late tonight. I want to thank you all for joining us for what is the first virtual version of our History at Night program. So like every museum, we're dealing with a new world with this pandemic and some of the restrictions on visitation, and trying to navigate this as wisely as we all can. It had a particular impact on us because one of our best programs over the last few months had been this History at Night program, where we've been bringing in speakers and presenters and averaging about 75 people one night a month to come out and enjoy these sessions. So now that I can't pack 75 of you into the same room for a little while, and we'll figure out how we land in a better place hopefully soon, we were excited to have a chance to explore History at Night virtually. And we're particularly excited that I was able to talk my longtime friend Dan Utley, a very prominent public historian, into joining us tonight. We had been talking about, we'd specifically been talking about this book that we're going to use as a lead-in going back a couple of years. The book was published in 2018, and we decided, here we are the week of Father's Day, it's a great opportunity to merge history and golf, two things that we think a lot of dads probably love. For those of you that are shopping tonight, there will be a retail opportunity. You'll have to take some action on your own to contact us and let us know you're interested in either Dan's book, which we can get personalized for you in the next few days, or we have a couple of other items that we're bundling with that book, and you'll see a slide for that later. I want to give you just a really short bio, and I also want to mention there is a Q&A section at the end of tonight's program. So we expect this interview to run roughly 45 minutes for those of you that have that much patience to sit here and watch two historians blather back and forth. So at that 45 to 50-minute mark, I'm going to open this up to questions. And just for utility and to make sure that we get as many answered as we can and that there's not any duplication, we're going to be asking you to submit questions via the chat feature. So obviously, if you do a lot of Zooming, if you're working from home and you're used to these platforms with Teams or Zoom or whatever, all of them have a raise your hand and we can video you in for posterity's sake. And we're willing to take this one for the team. Dan and I will be the only two mugs that make a video appearance in this whole gig. And
that's all we need.
Thanks. If you get tired of me, just focus on him. He's going to do most of the talking tonight. And then, of course, as you can see, we'll have a brief little slideshow that supports some of tonight's discussion. But if you have questions, and if you already know questions, feel free to start queuing them up in the chat room, in the chat feature, sorry. And as we go through, just put them through as they come to you. If you hear something you want to ask a little more about, feel free to do that. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. That said, we're going to spend about 20 minutes on Q&A probably. We're not going to stay all night, so we want to respect Dan's time. We don't want this to be a recording that goes on forever once we post it after tonight's live broadcast. All right, so without any further ado, I want to introduce you all to Dan Utley briefly. I want to start, Dan. I'm going to let you answer a quick question, and then I'm going to run through some of the highlights of your history vita or resume. All of us that I know in this field have kind of a defining moment of when we realized we were a history nerd, kind of a self-identification, and maybe a 12-step program might be involved. But I'm curious for you, when did you realize you were on this crazy history track?
Well, I guess there were probably several steps along the way, but one is I got started reading biographies, and that's what got me interested in the past. I read those more than a sweeping narrative histories of things. And I like to self-identify.
What age are we talking about? How old were you reading biographies?
Oh, four? No, I'm teasing. You know, probably in junior high school.
Okay.
Places like that.
Sure.
But I had no idea you could make a career out of history other than teaching. And also, since we're talking about, we're close to Father's Day, I'll bring in my dad at this point. My dad was one of the family storytellers, and his name was Festus Utley, great Southern name. His family came from North Carolina, settled in Bell County around Salado and Belton. And we lived in East Texas. So from time to time, we would travel over to Central Texas, you know, Christmas, Thanksgiving, things like that. And he would take me out and show me places. You know, this is where such and such a fort was. This is where the old homestead was. This is where the Chisholm Trail went, places like that. So he was always taking me to the site. And sadly though, he never knew I became a historian because he passed away before I got into the history field.
Well, I'm glad you got a chance to share that as an inspiration. And I would say maybe it's good that he didn't realize you really can't make a living in history other than academia or whatever. So he missed out on that fun for you as well. I should have mentioned, of course, we thanks to the help of the staff here, we have adorned Stephen F. Austin. I'm in the lobby of the museum here at San Felipe de Austin, at the Visitor Center. So you can see Stephen F. Austin from one of our murals behind me, and he's got his clubs ready. Dan, if we get motivated before this is over, if we need to pick up a driver and head out, we're good to go.
Austin's
Real
not
quickly,
much of a golfer, though. Most people don't know that.
actually, I'm thinking if we asked that question, most people would get it right. What
Yeah.
was Steve's handicap? Not good. Um, Real quickly, I just want to run down part of what I know about your career, and I'm certainly very proud to have known you for the better part of 20 years. Um, for all of you playing along at home, Dan was a seventh grade Texas history teacher. Actually, he taught multiple subjects at different grade levels, but spent some time in the Texas history wheelhouse. For those of you that know, that's one of those grade level focuses, and taught both in the district that he grew up in Woodville, and also in the Cy-Fair district here in the suburbs of Houston. Cy-Fair is right in that suburban corridor that's in the mix of the schools that we serve every year here at San Felipe. Obviously, field trips are kind of in a strange state right now, but that's an area that we focus on quite a bit. And so I'm excited to know you've got that passed. Um, I'm going to let you talk a little bit later about understanding the opportunity to transition into a more traditional history job. But Dan spent 2 stints with the Texas Historical Commission, the agency that I work for and that my colleagues here are part of, and that manages this particular property here at San Felipe de Austin, along with some 30 other state historic sites. And those 2 stints mostly involved work in research and on the Texas Historical Marker Program, on the Courthouse Preservation Program, and where I met Dan was in some of the early heritage tourism initiatives that began roughly in 2000 that our agency helped spearhead, kind of relaunch of some of these heritage trails programs and that sort of thing. Dan retired from our agency after a second stint and went to work at Texas State University as a public historian. And I've had a privilege of working with him in his classes over the last decade in that capacity as well. And I want you to tell us, Dan, between your stints with our agency, you went off and became a bit of an oral history rock star from people that I know, and did some work for Baylor University. So talk about how that chapter of your career unfolded.
Well, it actually begins with the University of Texas. They had a research center for cultural resource management, which was where archaeologists go out before a project starts and try to find out what is out there and what might be impacted by the development or whatever.
Sure.
And so they needed a historian, and I worked with 25 archaeologists, and then there was one historian, me, and in part of the research, we had time constraints, and we were right ahead of the bulldozers in a lot of ways.
Sure.
And
We're
so
doing that project right here, right now, by the way.
I found out one of the shortcuts we could take was to do more oral history and less deed research and things like that. We did that as well. But if we had to have something very quickly, oral history was a good way to do that. So we contracted with a gentleman named Dr. Thad Sitton, and Thad is one of the premier oral historians in the state. And so I sat in on the first few interviews he did, and this was out in Fayette County,
Okay.
around LaGrange.
Yeah, close to us too.
Yeah, and I watched him work, and I thought, I can do this. So I got a bunch of books, including books by a man named Tom Charlton, who we'll talk about in a minute. Um, and I've spent the rest of my career trying to be as good as Thad Sitton.
Wow. I know a lot of people who think you succeeded on that front, so good job.
Well, what happened though was at some point, Tom Charlton, who was the guru of oral history, just passed away about a year ago. He was at the Institute for Oral History at Baylor University, and he asked me to come join that group. And I had been doing oral history on my own, but I thought this is a chance to work for the very best. And he became my mentor in oral history. So I am very much a student of Tom Charlton. And that's starting to change, by the way. Oral history is changing because of what's happening with the pandemic. So oral history may not be one-on-one anymore. It may be just like what we're doing. And you lose a little bit of the, the facial expressions and things like that we use to tell us how the questioning's going. But I went to Baylor and worked for 2 years with Tom Charleston.
So that's an interesting reflection on technology, though, in that, right now I've known people who found that the internet became a great boon to doing research and doing genealogy or doing history research. So to understand that probably oral historians will transition to that format too, that makes a lot of sense. I agree with you. We'll lose some nuance, but that makes a lot of sense. I want to ask you, some of our listeners, I presume, are going to think that you might be someone who knows some stuff and can share some really cool ideas.
Well, they
And
came to the wrong place.
well, if I don't motivate them to buy your golf book tonight, which is the only one I have in my gift shop currently, maybe they'll appreciate knowing what you've got on your nightstand right now. Oh, look, he's got the
This is
golf
what I
book on
have
his
on my
nightstand.
nightstand. My nightstand is just full of my books. That's all I have on.
I heard you had an ego, but I was hoping we could tap that down tonight.
Well, actually, I've been reading since I retired just a few weeks ago. I've actually been going back and picking up some mystery books and getting away from history for a while. But I've read 3 good books lately that I'd like to talk about, and one is an A&M Press book called Biebs and the Bear, which is about Gene Stallings and Bear Bryant.
Oh, wow.
A guy named Ron Jackson. Excellent book, sports history about the Cotton Bowl and things like that. Very well done. And he uses a lot of oral history in there as well.
Sure, sure.
Um, and then a very beautiful book in terms of its literary value. The painting of the cultural landscape is a book by David Keller called In the Shadow of the Chonodis, which is about roughly the Big Bend area of West Texas. And it is beautifully written. It stands alone as a piece of literary art, but it's also good history. And then a third one that I have read, which is not out yet, I read it as a manuscript for A&M Press, and it's called Boggy Slough, and it's by a good friend of mine, Jonathan Gerland. And Jonathan lives in Diboll, or lives in
Okay.
Lufkin, works in Diboll at the History Center. And he has written what I think is going to be one of the most important environmental histories of Texas, but it's about a specific area of East Texas. And that will be coming out, who knows, a year and a half. So,
All right. There's a little history privilege for you all, folks, that Dan knows people. He's dropping books on you that you should put on your list for Father's Day 2023. We'll get you all squared away. Make that work. All right, Dan, without any further ado, let's start talking. Just so those of you who are playing at home again kind of understand, the golf book was a great motivator for us. We've been wanting to do a program with Dan for some time and just managed to hold off until we had this public health crisis that would complicate things even further. But one of the reasons we were excited is that there's an association with our site, and he's going to talk about that here shortly. That's not the whole program. So if you're not a golf person and you're already getting bored, we're going to do a short little golf stint, and then we're going to talk about some of Dan's work in the marker program and a couple of books he's written about Texas historical markers that I think you'll really find rewarding. So if you don't like the golf, hang in there. It's going to get better. If you like it all, just brace yourself. We're going to have a lot of fun tonight.
If I can jump in here.
Sure.
As you and I have discussed, this is not a golf book. It's
Right.
got golf in it, but
Correct.
It's really a history book where golf comes into play.
All right, Steve, you can put the clubs away. So let's just jump right in and give us a sense. I think I asked you when we started talking about this project, do you think you have to have been someone who appreciated golf to find yourself at a precipice where this book could get written? And maybe more importantly, what's the pitch on this book? You just mentioned it's not a golf book. What was the pitch that you told people, this is what I'm going to write about? This is what it's going to be?
What happens is a friend of mine, actually my former boss, Stan Graves, Stan Graves and I worked for the Historical Commission at the same time, and we both played golf. Although I'm not sure you can consider what I play as golf. I have a whole different set of rules, and I play Baptist rules too, by the way, so that tells you something. But we would occasionally go on trips around the state together, or we would be at commission meetings and we would take our sticks, as we said, and afterward we would go out and play golf. And as we did that, we liked to play the rural courses, the small, off the beaten path courses, because fewer crowds. It's easier for us to play mulligans, things like that.
I think I helped y'all plan a trip to play a course in Victoria 20 years ago. So yeah.
Yeah. And people would tell us stories, well, there's you're going to play on the number 4 hole, there used to be a log cabin out there, or this was built by the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps,
Right.
or one golf course had a Presidio in the middle of it. You actually played through the ruins of the Presidio. So we started thinking about, I wonder if there are enough sites here for a book. And we started jotting these down, and we came up with 33. Then the idea was to let's pare it down to 18, have 18 historic holes.
Sure.
So the elevator pitch is that this is a book about 18 historic sites. And the only thing they have in common is that they're now golf courses.
That's fabulous. I'd read that book.
To get to that point, though, we had to also tell the story of the golf course itself. But it's primarily a history book about sites that are now golf courses.
Well, I'm pleased that you've shared with us some of your favorite ones from the book, and without any further ado, we're going to let you share them with our viewers tonight. So let's jump right in.
Well, we'll start with a pretty dramatic one to begin with. And this picture, by the way, is from a friend of mine, Cynthia Beeman. She helped us out with photo documentation for the book. This is the Onion Creek mosasaur, which lived along the tributaries of the Colorado River, kind of south and southeast of Austin.
Okay.
And the interesting thing about this one, I think, is that there were different ways we approached different stories. And on this one, we didn't have the history first. We had the course first. I wanted to get Onion Creek Country Club in there because it was the site of the Legends of Golf. It's where the Legends of Golf began. So I wanted the story of the golf course. Then I had to go find the history. And the history took me back to 65 million years ago, which is a good place to start, back before my birth even. And that's when these lizards, these lizard-like creatures that swam like snakes, would ply the waters above Onion Creek, what is now Onion Creek. This particular one was discovered near Bergstrom Airport, the Austin Airport. But it gives you an example, I think, of how far back you have to go sometimes as a historian. I had to really reach back and get into the paleontology and geology and things like that to understand the story. And the creature was discovered in the 1920s and unearthed in the 1930s, and now resides at the Texas Memorial Museum in Austin.
So there we got a label up for those of you that are playing at home again. You can see just to remember that this is the Onion Creek Country Club. Anything you all see tonight in this program, the program is being recorded. So if you need to come back and make a note, there will be some bibliographies at the end on books that Dan's written and some other things we can share with you. But let's move on and see what the next hole is that you want to share, next course.
Oh, this one's pretty good too, and the visual here is pretty striking. What you're looking at is an archaeological dig with archaeologists driving golf carts. So it kind of brings the whole thing to the fore. And you can see the cart path around the top there. This story came about because of my friendship with an archaeologist named Doug Boyd. And Doug Boyd is one of the premier archaeologists in the state. He and I have worked together in the past and also serve on a board together. We serve on the Antiquities Advisory Board for the state of Texas. And on his own, he had come up with a thesis about how golf courses a lot of times are located on archaeological sites. And I had come up with the fact that they're located on historical sites. And so in our travels around the state, we started comparing notes. And he was very generous to let me tap into his research and talk about the archaeological part of the story. So this goes back to prehistory, but also proto-history, the contact period of Texas. And this particular one is San Felipe Springs. It has nothing to do with San Felipe de Austin. San Felipe Springs Golf Course in Del Rio, Valverde County along the Rio Grande. And I thought it was a good way to show that, again, we have to reach back as historians sometimes to pick up the story.
This is my favorite photo from any of the golf courses, just because it is such a great blend of archaeology, history, golf. The golf cart is a fabulous piece of that picture. And honestly, Dan, I think you could hit that hole if you could play through to that
I
that
could
hole
I
there in
could
the
hit
middle.
that hole, yeah.
I'm thinking you
That'd
probably
be a
could.
two putt for me.
All right, let's see what's third on our golf course list tonight.
This one's interesting. The picture's not the best, and I apologize for that. But again, you can see the cart path. And from the furthest reach of the cart path, that's where you would be as a golfer playing in. So you'd be playing near this feature. And what you're looking at here are the remains of the Hancock Springs bathhouse. And back in the 1890s, 1880s, it was a big deal to go to these spas around the state and what they call take the waters, therapeutic waters that supposedly helped you and would heal certain maladies that you had. What's interesting in this picture, if you look down in the lower right corner, you can see the line of a line of limestone blocks, and that's outlining one of the springs. I think there are 7 springs that feed Sulphur Creek here. Off to the left, about 300 yards, was where there was a huge hotel, had 200 rooms, a wooden hotel called the Park, and it burned in 1895. And after that, this site never really gained its prominence again. It's still used as a public swimming area, but the remains are there from a bygone era.
I think we decided when we were looking at this the other day that right next to that limestone ring for the spring are clearly some golf balls lost by historian golfers. Don't you think that's what that is?
Oh yeah, I'm sure several of mine are in there too.
Go figure. Research, man, research. All right, let's look at number 4 on the golf course list. Oh, look, it's a place I know.
And now we're back to San Felipe, but a different San Felipe. This is your
Right.
San Felipe and relates to the background behind you. Um, this is one where the story changed once I started doing the research. I knew that through your research that the golf course that's at San Felipe now, at Stephen F. Austin State Park, was located on land owned by Baron de Bastrop and originally, and part of the Austin colony. And so I thought that was going to be the story I was going to focus on. But in doing the research, I found that there was a more compelling, more recent story. And that is that during the Jim Crow era, um, there were efforts, there was talk about having separate state parks for African Americans. And Stephen F. Austin State Park, at least the recreational area, the
The historical area.
yeah, the historical area was going to be set aside for African Americans for use as picnic grounds and so on like that. That never came to be, but I thought it was interesting that that was under consideration in the 1950s. That
Yeah,
we'll set rather than integrate the parks, we'll segregate them and give the African Americans separate parks.
right. You mentioned there's kind of a regional approach to that, and San Felipe ended up being this sort of central southeast focus. That was an amazing story when you shared it with us. So just so that the readers understand, if they've not been to the museum before or to the visitor center here, the map is a multiple overlay of the original plat of the town. And our thanks to the General Land Office for that image, along with some topographic maps, including one that shows the migration of the Brazos River. And the lots that Dan is referring to, lots 1 and 2, they're what we call the garden lots, large acreage lots to the west of the main town, are the 2 that were owned by the Baron de Bastrop, and today host the entrances to both the state park, Stephen F. Austin State Park, managed by Parks and Wildlife, and to the Stephen F. Austin Golf Course, which early on had a partnership with the state, but now is privately run by a private nonprofit. And I should add, the golf course, as well as the state park, have been victimized by these recent spate of Brazos River flooding, historic flooding over the last 5 years. So the golf course is not currently open. So for those of you that want to grab your clubs and join Steve here behind me and head out to the course this week, I know that the new owners are working on some development, and I think there'll be news coming fairly soon about when the course will reopen. There are plans to reopen it, to my understanding, but for now, we're going to talk about its history. We don't get a chance to go out and play.
You know, it's
So
interesting you bring it up too, because I told you, remember, we came up with 33 sites originally.
sure,
Some of those had closed, so they didn't make it into the book. We wanted to have courses that were open. And now
understood.
that the book is out, 2 of these courses have closed.
I am
Golf is
confident that
changing
this
just as everything else is changing. Golf's changing.
Sure, but I am confident that this is temporary, at least I hope in the case of Stephen
Yeah.
F. Austin. And for those of you that have played this course before, I actually borrowed the clubs behind me from one of our friends, board members, David Hubenek. So howdy, David, if you're out there. Um, we've been doing, like a lot of museums, a golf tournament fundraiser through our friends group. So we have a very intimate relationship with the course. And in fact, we put some interpretive panels on the course over the years that we hope we can revive as the course comes back in. All right, so I think I get to take a stab at this one, Dan. I got a chance to share with you during your research an interesting artifact that a local resident of town brought to me. And these kind of things happen all the time because San Felipe de Austin was burned. There's a lot of ground scatter archaeology. There's a lot of remnant archaeology that makes its way to the surface. And so that piece you see there was found by a local supporter of ours. Hi, Steve, if you're watching from home, I hope you like that we included your artifact. And he came to me thinking that it might be evidence of a Mexican military uniform, a button from a uniform. And as we started researching it, we figured out it had a very different history, but not surprisingly, when this button is found at places throughout the country, people often mistake it for some kind of a military piece if they really can't see the design. So we're going to reveal some of the design to you. There's a little better look at it. What our neighbor thought was crossed sabers are actually crossed golf clubs, if you can see them there in that bottom image, and there's a nice clean one of it. So this relates to the history of golf in St. Andrews in Scotland and the whole 9 yards. It's got a thistle weed as part of the representation of the rough there and all this stuff. So it was really exciting for us to figure out, while it was not a Mexican artifact, it was a unique one. And I should add, for a place where we sometimes have gophers and other rodents do some archaeology for us inadvertently, in this case, when our resident friend Steve brought this to us, he described it as archaeology by chicken, which was a first. So this was found in his chicken coop where they had scratched up this button that he brought in. And while we couldn't tell him that it belonged to Santa Anna or one of his soldiers, it was a fun story either way. I'm glad it made your book.
Good. Yeah, I didn't want to lose that story.
So if you find this button somewhere, don't be shocked if you try to convince yourself and your friends that it's a Revolutionary War button or a Texas military button. But we've got enough expertise now. We can help you figure out if it's a golf blazer button. So I think you chose this next photo to talk about
Yeah, and I
history as an
wanted that in there.
opportunity.
You were very gracious to give me time to do research at San Felipe, and part of that was to do an oral history with you. And it was a very timely moment because I think this was 2017. Does that sound right?
This was probably in late 17 or, yeah, it was 2017. You're right. That's when it was.
And the building that you're in now was under construction.
Correct.
So I took this to sort of document where history was at the time because I was going to finish the book before the building was finished. So we sort of put this in there as a marker to show history is continuing on at the site. One of the things that Bryan always came and talked to my class about was that, and we teased about it, was that he had to interpret history where there was no site, where there was nothing, because everything had been burned and it was archaeology. And so it was the history of a place where there was no place. And I wanted to document that now there is a place to go to, and I recommend everybody go there to see the new museum, which is great.
So in the course of working on the book, as Dan noted, we included this photo as a way to motivate people who might get the book when it first came out in 2018 and not know that we were here. I'll also add, while I enjoyed coming and talking to the students over the last decade, the first year we opened, I think he used the excuse that we had to be so busy, he just forgot about wanting to bother me. But Dan almost didn't invite me to come back and talk. So I was a little miffed that I'd spent 10 years talking about having nothing here. And then the year I had something, I wasn't on the guest speaker list, but we revived and I got a chance to come back and talk to the students. So this was a great project to share with people who are considering careers in public history and
I
Dan's
will add,
legacy.
by the way,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
that you came to the class this year on March the 11th, and
Right.
on March the 12th, our world turned upside down. So
Very
uh,
true.
we got in under the wire this year in person.
Yeah, Dan and I had dinner the night I was there on the 11th as this was starting to break, all of the pandemic and schools closing and things. And I'm gonna thank you for not telling people the world turned upside down on the 12th because it was my wife's birthday. But I was able to get back for that and celebrate as these things began. Been a lot of fun to talk with your students. And what I started to say in terms of a legacy, I'm sure it's one you're proud of amongst many things as an author, as a researcher, as an historian. But there are a lot of people out there who've had the privilege of learning from you during your course as a teaching historian, and I'm sure you're going to feel the impact of that, as we all will, over the next decade or so. All
You
right.
know, after March the 11th, we went to Zoom
Sure.
and we finished out the semester, and the students were fantastic. They put up with this old geezer trying to learn, digital age things, and but we made it, and we had a good time, and I think they learned something in the process. I know I did.
Well, I think that's a mark of a great educator. If you're learning while you teach, that's only going to benefit the students that are working
Oh,
with
listen,
you. And
there are nights that I'm the teacher, and there are nights that I'm the student, and I believe that strongly.
very nice. So I want to take a minute and talk briefly about your time with our agency, where you had such a legacy and an impact with the Texas Historical Marker Program, which is to a large degree what I knew about you early on 20 years ago, although I mentioned we met through that heritage tourism aspect. So talk a little bit about your work on the marker program. I'm curious if you believe there's any kind of a holy grail, a marker that you worked on that you'll remember till you take your last breath. But what do you
Oh
got?
gosh, you caught me off guard there. But one that we didn't show here is the school book depository,
Oh, wow.
which probably more people have read than any marker that I wrote.
I have a
There
refrigerator
are,
magnet of that marker at the house.
yeah, and it's been vandalized, so we didn't show that that marker. But there's something in the order of 18,000, 19,000 markers, and I wrote about 3,000 of those, somewhere in that range,
Wow.
2,500 to 3,000. And this began because I was teaching at Sci-Fair in Houston, but I wanted to use my history degree somehow more than just teaching. And so I went to Austin and looked for work, and I found a job as a historian at the Texas Historical Commission. And when I found the job posting, I was vain enough to think, well, this is my job. Nobody's going to apply for this job but me. I'm the only one with a history degree ready to go. And turns out 80 people applied. But Claire Williams, who was the director of research at the time, fortunately hired me, and that started my career as a public historian. And so there are a lot of markers that I've written that I have visited, and that's quite a treat sometimes. There's some that I have forgotten because I did a lot of markers for banks and newspapers and clubs and churches and things like that that I've forgotten over time. But some of them I remember quite well as I see them. I know it's one of mine. Generally, if it's the date 1979 to 1983, it's one of mine. Although I continue to write, I still write markers from time to time for the historical commission.
Very nice. So one of the things we can establish from that little sidebar is that in 1979, you were already one of the top 80 historians in the state, right? Does that seem fair? Uh,
Yeah, well, top 80 applicants. Yeah,
okay, well, some of them might not have been historians by the standard. Who knows? That might have been their only
sure.
shot at history, fame, and fortune. So I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm glad you talked about that deja vu moment. I think I can only imagine if you had touched that many different historical markers, which for our listeners tonight, that's probably one of the ways many of them best know our agency. Some of them know other programs and know other things we do, and now that we're managing historic sites, they're getting to know us this way. But I think everybody who loves history in Texas has had a moment with grandpa or mom and dad pulling over and reading a marker. So that's a really ubiquitous experience for
Well,
Texas
and to put
history.
it in context, 18,000 to 19,000 markers. The closest state, which may be Georgia or New York or Pennsylvania, has about 3,000.
Wow.
So, as a friend of mine says, the day is going to come when you can't back out of your house without running into a marker, and we're pretty close to that now. But
I've
Texas
heard
has
the
got a lot of good stories to tell, and there's still a lot of history to be
And I've
recorded.
heard the rumor that Texans love their history, so it sounds like we've found that proof. So, much
Absolutely.
like with the golf courses, we wanted to give you a chance to talk about the fact that you've written a couple of books with your former colleague Cynthia Beeman, History Ahead There and History Along the Way, which tell some of the behind the scenes stories of some of your favorite markers. And so, we wanted you to have a chance to share with our viewers tonight some of those specific markers and the stories that you want to make sure resonate with them. So,
Yeah,
let's
let me
jump
tell you
in.
how this came about.
Sure, go ahead.
Uh, Cynthia was my boss at the Historical Commission, and she had also been a marker writer, and she's probably written as many or maybe more markers than I did. Uh, but because we worked in the marker program, we got to see all the correspondence that is behind the marker process. And some of it's pretty funny. Some of it's pretty tough. Some of it's, pretty pointed and things like that. But we knew where the stories were, and so that was our idea, was to tell behind the scenes stories about the historical markers in Texas.
Very nice. Well, without any further ado, we're going to jump into a few of those so that you can share them with our viewers.
Okay. This is one, I wanted this slide in there because it shows how we start with one story and end up with another one. As I mentioned with the mosasaur, I started with the story of the golf course and worked back. This is a picture by a friend of mine named Randy Mallory. And Randy took, at our suggestion, took a picture of what is the Zephyr Tabernacle in the town of Zephyr, Texas, which is in Brown County out west Texas, not too far from Brownwood and Abilene. And it's just a beautiful picture of an outdoor wooden tent that was used for revivals and weddings and used in the summer months when it was too hot to be inside of a closed church before they had air conditioning. And so I decided I would write a chapter on the Zephyr Tabernacle. And here's the history of the Zephyr Tabernacle. They built one, it burned, they built another one. It was hard to stretch that into a chapter. So then I decided, well, where can we take this story? So I branched out and looked at where were all the tabernacles that had been marked in Texas and came up with a collection of them in Erath County, Stephenville area. And so the chapter becomes more about the structure, why they're disappearing, how they were used. There are early historical quotes about revivals and camp meetings that were held at these that are pretty funny. And it harkens back to my own history because growing up in East Texas, I went to camp meetings at some of these tabernacles in East Texas.
Very nice. So on the geography front, we straddled the central west line there below. So those of you that are going to find this in Brown County, it's a little further west in the hill country, heading out between Brownwood and Abilene. Apologies for that. All right, let's move on to the next piece of excitement. How about this one?
Yeah, this one is one that when Cynthia and I do talks about historical markers and about our books, we always like to show this one because not only is it a poignant picture, but it's a picture of a very famous individual who is not a Texan, but who had quite a career in Texas and came to Texas seeking to be a cowboy. And so we open it up and we'll say, you know, as a point of discovery, who do you think this is? And we get strange things like Dick Cheney, Rick Perry. And I'll tell them it's not a military person, and they'll say Dick Cheney, Rick Perry, things like that. But I want you to look into the eyes of this person, and I'll tell you his first name is William, second name is Penn, third name is Adair, and the last name is Rogers. This is Will Rogers.
Wow.
Known today as one of the great humorists in the United States and died in 1935. And the story that we pick up is that he ran away from home, ran away from a military school, and came to Texas to be a cowboy and followed that adventure as much as he could, ended up with the gauchos in Argentina and ended up with a Wild West show where he learned to rope, taught by an African-American cowboy. It's a good story, but he's not known as a Texan.
Excellent. All right, so we've got a few more markers before we transition out.
This is a good story. This is Jesse Daniel Ames, who was born in Palestine in East Texas in Anderson County, but she grew up in Georgetown, went to school at Southwestern University at Georgetown, and became an early suffragist in the state and led a very tough life. She had a very difficult marriage and ended up divorcing. And she was a single mom with 3 children. She ran the telephone exchange in Georgetown, but she was interested in women's rights, and she worked to get women the right to vote in Texas. But significantly outside of Texas, she became known for her work fighting lynching and trying to get anti-lynching legislation at the national level. So she's actually known more outside of Texas than in Texas.
Very good. All right, let's see what's next.
This is one of my favorites. This is, and I would call your attention to the gentleman in the very front playing the guitar, and that's Charlie Christian. And this is the Benny Goodman Sextet. This is Lionel Hampton on the vibraphone, and there's Benny Goodman playing the clarinet in front. I won't go into all the personnel there, but Charlie Christian was born in Bonham up in Fannin County along the Red River. And he very early on got interested in music, and first the trumpet, but then he changed to the guitar. And back then, you have to understand, to put it in a context, the guitar was a rhythm instrument. You know, people played the guitar, chung, 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 just kept the rhythm. But Charlie Christian played around with the electric guitar, which has a genesis in Texas through a man named Eddie Durham, who came out of San Marcos, one of the earliest people to experiment with electric guitar. And Charlie Christian thought, I can make my guitar sound like a saxophone. That's where he got started. And so he started playing melody lines and got picked up by the Benny Goodman Orchestra. What's interesting is that in music history, this is a benchmark. There's AC and BC and AC. There's before Christian, after Christian, because he changed the guitar so much that it now, everybody that plays the guitar, an electric guitar, and stands out in front of the orchestra, they owe their heritage to their musical heritage to Charlie Christian. One thing I want to add, though, is that he died in 1942 at the age of 25.
Wow. So that's quite a legacy. That we talk about William Travis as a resident of our town dying at age 26 at the Alamo. That's a pretty comparable, massive legacy. Thinking about how people would
Interesting
look
too,
back.
he died on March the 2nd, which is
Well, there you go, Independence Day, and Sam Houston's birthday for those. Yeah. All right. So I think we have one more that we wanted to share tonight.
And the reason I wanted to put this one in there is because this personally was important to me. This is a gathering in the woods of men who were interested in not only the timber industry in East Texas, but in conservation. And conservation, you have to put this in context. This is 1909, and conservation is very new. Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot are sort of inventing it as they go along. And that's Gifford Pinchot in the front row with the handlebar mustache, third from the left there. But these are lumber barons, these are conservationists, these are federal employees, U.S. Forester, and they're all coming together in the East Texas woods around the town of Woodville, where I grew up, to talk about the fact that, we can't keep cutting all the timber and not replacing it. So this is one of the earliest gatherings of all these interested people to talk about conservation. Now, what's interesting here in particular is that they went ahead and cut all the wood anyway. And so the timber was gone and they had to leave East Texas. And when they did, they went out west. So the same timber groups that had come down from the Midwest to cut the southern timber, cut it all out and then left. It was an era that they called cut out and get out, the bonanza era of lumber in Texas. But it was important to me because it was my hometown and because it led me to read more about conservation history.
Well, to the point that I made earlier about the impact of Texas historical markers, and we have visitors that come to the facility here almost every day who talk about either having a youthful experience that helped motivate them in their love of lifelong learning, or who specifically stopped at markers as they were coming out. There's plenty of references to other works on markers that people find to be really important. But I get a lot of questions specifically about your two books. When people talk about markers, they tend to know your books. And I think these two show some really, really fabulous stories. So we're excited you could share that with folks here today.
Well, by the way, I think Cynthia Beeman is in the audience tonight.
Excellent.
So we'll put her on the spot and say there should be another book coming out.
Well, I've got a question about that coming up. So hold that thought, Dan. We're going to get to that as part of the Q&A. To that end, we certainly hope that you're going to see a bibliography of Dan's here coming up shortly. And while I mentioned earlier, I've only got the one book in my gift shop, and we'll talk about that in a second. Obviously, you can get access. I think we decided most of your works are still in print, Dan. So these are books that you can access. If there's a particular one or a
the reason they're still in print because they printed more than they sold.
Okay, so we're still on a first run on all these books, but still, they're available to you out there. So for any of you who have an interest, and I realize you're not going to get this to Dad by Sunday, but print him a nice coupon if you think there's something that motivated you tonight to give something to your father. We're not above you buying it for yourself. Get what you want and have a good time. I mentioned we've hosted a golf tournament, and it was just a good fortune. Our retail development coordinator here, many of you know Shelley Wong, who works for us, had used the name, had introduced the name Links to the Past as our tournament game, our golf tournament name. And so when Dan came to us and said he was going to use that as a book title, we thought, wow, that's wonderful. That's a great connector to both our site and to our story in ways that we can use. So you can see there the Links to the Past golf towel is a holdover from our days of holding golf tournaments. So it's not necessarily something we did for the book, but what a great pairing. And then that wonderful green cap, which has an abstracted version of the San Felipe flag on the side. For those of you that are flag lovers, it's probably my favorite cap in our collection. And we didn't show a bundle of all of them, but if you want all three of those items, we'll make that work for you too. So if you have any interest in retailing after this program, either email us here. My email is going to come up at the end of the program, or you can call our main number and we'll work with you and get something squared away and get it shipped out to you. We are going to be able to personalize books. If you just want to buy the book, or if you want a signed book with your package, we're going to be able to personalize books ordered by this Sunday. So if you call us tomorrow, Saturday or Sunday, we'll make a notation and you can tell us what you'd like Dan to say to personalize the book, and then we'll get them shipped out to you. Beyond that, in terms of the Q&A, if something motivated you tonight, we've got a handful of questions queued up that I'm going to jump into shortly. There's still time, so feel free. If you have not filed a question but you want to, go ahead. To Dan's point about audience, we've been bouncing around a little bit, but it looks like we've got about 50 of us who have been participating, including those of us that are helping on the tech side. So that's pretty close to the numbers we get. Like I said, we've been averaging about 75 for our in-person History at Night programs, and we've been super excited at the response to that program. We've absolutely benefited from some great presenters over the course of this first year. And I'm sad that we had to cancel 2 programs while we were getting ready for working this out virtually with Dan. So we lost Judge Ken Wise, the producer of the Wise About Texas podcast. We'll be bringing him back in the fall. And we also lost former curator of history at the Alamo, Dr. Bruce Winders. So we'll be rescheduling him as well. So keep an eye on season 2 of History at Night. We're contemplating a couple of other virtual versions. So let us know if you're watching and you like this, or if we can do something better for you. We may do a couple of other virtuals before we get back to real life. Dan, this is a slide that I took off of your Facebook page. And so it had some comments there, and people really responded to it. You've already made some comments tonight that show how circular public history can be, how some of the same issues keep coming back and we keep redressing and trying to figure out ways to navigate those. I know you have some very pointed thoughts about perceptions of history when people label things as being revisionist but aren't really. Give us some thoughts on how history works for you and how it evolves.
Well, back when my sister graduated from high school, she wanted to get into history. And her advisor said, "Why would you get into history? It never changes." So she got into English literature. And I'm not sure if there's a joke there or not, but the fact is that history changes all the time. And it's changing daily. And it's changing sometimes faster than people can handle. But to me, that's part of the excitement of history, is to go back and find something that somebody's overlooked or maybe misinterpreted, or maybe it needs to be reinterpreted in the present time. Lewis Mumford, an urban history historian, said, each generation has to reinterpret history in its own set of values, in its own insights, and their own way of looking at things. And so I believe that very strongly. It's up to us to go back and find history and make it fit into the understanding of our current time. And so I think that's exciting. And a lot of the stories we've been talking about tonight are taking old stories and telling them in new ways and presenting them to a new audience. There are a lot of people listening in right now that didn't know who Will Rogers was, but maybe they'll go back and check out who he was and find out more about him. So,
well, to your point about discovery, I have the privilege of managing a site here that, quite frankly, the state of Texas struggled with what to do with for some 100 years almost. The reason that you were inviting me to your class to talk to those students about interpreting a landscape that was mostly erased was part of that challenge. And so there were occasions I would meet people who said, well, if this was so important, the museum would already exist. And this is a founding era site that's connected to all the great stories of Texas independence and early players in Mexican history and Mexican Texas history. And so for us, it's not that we're revising history, it's that we're going back and uncovering things that nobody's looked at before. And that gives us a new perspective. And to your point, history organizations across the country are trying to broaden the scope of who history appeals to. How do you find ways to incorporate people whose stories may have been lost, in some cases deliberately? And so that's an important part of our story too.
Yeah, I will tell you too. I want to bring in something about my wife because she's put up with me for all these years as a public historian. And I've always thought the best way to be a successful public historian is to marry a successful educator. And so I want to give a shout out to my wife, Debbie Utley, who I've known, by the way, since she was 9 years old. She and I grew up together in Woodville. But what happens is that she grew up not appreciating history as much as I do, and part of that was the way that history was taught in our high school. It was kind of a secondary course. They didn't put a lot of effort into it. So when I'm doing research and I work late at night, I'll be working at like at 2 in the morning, and I'll put something together. I'll figure out something. So I immediately go wake her up and share it with her. And so I'm sure she appreciates that. I'd be waking up at 2 in the morning. But what is important about all that is that as a historian, and I believe this very strongly, there are times when you put things together that have not been put together and they make sense. And you realize I'm the first one here. This is new. And that gets exciting. And that is dynamic.
And I think we all hope when we have those moments that that's going to resonate with people who maybe don't live in history, but explore it as citizen scholars, and that they're going to have that same serendipitous moment. This is something they didn't know. We feel that at our place every day.
Yeah.
So let me jump into a few of the questions we've gotten through the chat, and we'll let you fire off at a couple of these.
And can I,
Go ahead.
turn on a buzzer if I don't want to hear the question?
You can blame me. Send me an email.
Okay.
So
Right.
one of the attendees tonight talked about you mentioning the changing future of oral history, obviously related to the technology changes and that kind of thing, and asked, do you foresee similar changes in the broader field of history or the museum field? How is this going to change what we're going through now in terms of how people explore and understand public history?
Yeah, absolutely. And this has changed very fast. It is still changing. And in fact, there are organizations out there like the Texas Oral History Association and the Oral History Association, the national organization, that are still trying to figure this out. Right now, Zoom looks like a good platform, but keep a recorder going at the same time. That may be a way to go for the future, but who knows what's on the horizon. Museums are changing because now you can do virtual tours and they don't have to go to the site to go through the museum. But to your question, and significantly, the next book that I'm working on is a history of Texas State University. So I'm still going to be associated with Texas State for a while, even though I've retired. But what's interesting is that now I have to find the records online because I can't go and take up space in an archives when somebody else may need it for something else. And so it limits how you can find the records. And I'm trained in the old school. I'm trained in finding original records, what we call primary sources. And that's just going to be harder to do going into the future. So yeah, it's going to change it dramatically. But we'll figure it out.
Yeah, so we're like everybody doing a lot more virtual and online stuff. This program tonight being evidence of that. And we'd love to have a bunch of you here with us in our front room in the Old 300 Learning Hall, having this experience and having a little social time before and after. But we're hoping that this structure can resonate with people, and that as a technique, it works for folks who are looking for this kind of content. I'll tell you, Dan, one of the things you mentioned that we're all a little nervous about, I think, in this field, is that everybody has had to pivot to this social media virtual content, and you start to wonder, does it start to replace the going? Do you get to a point where people aren't going to go? And so our agency that operates under this motto of real places telling real stories, we really see a value in putting boots on the ground where the history occurred. And I talk to visitors almost every day, certainly weekly, who feel that, and they talk about feeling the history emanate from the ground.
Yeah, let me tell you, I go back to something written by a historian named Gary Gallagher, who is at the University of Virginia. He's their Civil War historian, but from University of Texas, where he got his degree. And he said people will go where history occurred, even if the site is not there. And so there are people who seek out where things happened, even though it's downtown Houston now, or it's a Walmart parking lot, or it's a golf course. People are going to go out and try to find history where it occurred. There's just something in us who wants to be in that place. And
Right.
I'll
Well,
give you an example. You know, in Boston, at the grave of Paul Revere, I think is where I first saw it. Uh, I went into the cemetery, and then you can immediately tell from the track of dead grass from people walking where you can go to John Hancock's grave or Paul Revere's grave or whatever. People are going to go just stand at a grave and try to figure out what history means to them. And that's strong. It's powerful. It draws people.
yeah, we certainly believe that about a facility like this. So there's a couple of cheekier questions that'll be fun, just some little quick shots that we can run through. Cousin Scott wants to know your favorite marker in Bell County. So I'm guessing Cousin Scott joined us tonight.
Oh man, I guess Scott, I love you, man. The one that means most to me is the one called for Memorial Baptist Church, and that's where Scott's family and my family attended church. And I was privileged enough to write the historical marker for that, and to go back and speak at the reunion of a homecoming event where we unveiled the marker, and my cousin Patsy Daniel Beasley was there, and it was great fun. So I appreciate the question.
So you also mentioned a book about Texas State. We've had an attendee tonight ask, what other books do you have coming out? We're going to show your bibliography shortly, but also feel free to mention a couple of recent publications if you'd like, Dan.
Well, the most recent one is called SAC Time, SAC, SAC Time, Strategic Air Command, and it's written by a friend of mine named Thomas E. Alexander. And he was a major in the Air Force in the Strategic Air Command in the 1950s. And I was privileged to do his oral histories and turn those into a book. So I'm technically not the writer, but the editor. But that just came out very recently from A&M Press. Most of my books are coming from Texas A&M Press, although I'm a Longhorn by training.
So anything in addition to the Texas State book that you're currently working on?
Yeah, there are two. One is going to be a book about Curtis Tunnel. Curtis Tunnel was, for many years, the old state archaeologist of Texas, the first one. And then he became the director of the Texas Historical Commission, and I worked with him there and got to travel around, literally travel all over the state with him. He was a wonderful guy. And I got to do oral histories with him. And we did 52 1.5 hour interviews.
Wow.
And I'm condensing those down now to tell his life story. He has unfortunately passed away. He passed away in 2001. But he knew at the time that we were going to be putting out the book about him. And so it's taken a long time to get to this point, but that'll be done within a year or two. And then the third book is going to be a book of poetry, which I won't go into here.
Is it poems that I might have?
And poetry by Texas historians.
Oh, more than one. Okay. Might I have read some of these poems in a certain public historian's Christmas cards before?
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, excellent. And if you want to get on that list, I'll give Dan's address out here before the program's over. He's at his cozy home in Pflugerville joining us tonight. So I'll make sure you all know how to reach him. Just kidding. Just kidding, Debbie. All right. So I've got a handful of other questions, and I think we're wrapping this up right about on time. We hope to entertain you all for those that have stuck with us for a little more than an hour. And it looks like that's about where we're going to walk. Someone has asked in the audience, do you remember the very first marker you wrote? And does it resonate because it was first?
Yeah, I did. And it's in Lamb County in the far northwest panhandle. And I can't remember offhand the name of the cemetery, but it was a cemetery marker. And the reason it sticks with me in particular was that when I worked at the Historical Commission, I found myself on the road one day in Lamb County, and I thought, I'm going to take a picture of my first marker. And it's in the middle of nowhere. It's literally not near a town. It's 3 or 4 miles from the nearest settlement. And so I pulled the car up, state car, pulled out a tripod, put a camera on it, and went over, put my hand around the marker and took my picture. And at that point, I realized there was a farmer out in his field watching me very carefully, trying to figure out exactly what I was doing. I threw everything back in the car and took off. So that's why I remember that one in particular.
Cattle rustler that you look to be, or whatever. Um, Very good. So you mentioned earlier, well, I'm going to do one that's a softball, I think, and I think there are
Oh,
multiple answers to this. So you tell us what you think is best. Someone's asked about the best resource, whether it's a map or a digital resource to show the location of markers. How do they go out and investigate markers?
oh, there's only one place really, and that is to go to the Texas Historical Commission website and go to the Sites Atlas, Historic Sites Atlas, and it has every single marker in the state. And it will sometimes give you the inscription, sometimes not, because some of the ones that were done in the early days have not been digitized yet, but it'll give you the inscription. And there is a book called Why Stop that a lot of people quote, but
Sure.
it's only got about 2,000 to 3,000 markers in it. And as I mentioned, there's 18,000 to 19,000. So, um, and if Cynthia and I can keep writing books, you can keep coming back to our books. So,
So, as you mentioned earlier, the sort of generational reflection on history and how we evaluate and think about what means things to us. I know I've been in a session with you once before, I think, where the comment was made, I can't presume when I create a monument to some historical figure today that it's going to mean the same thing 100 years from now, 25 years from now to the people that are experiencing it. So we've had a question from someone in the audience about what you see as the effect of the sort of phenomenal and very rapid current rise of interest in cultural and historical matters related to African American citizens in this country. How do you see that having an impact on the study of history going forward?
well, I'm sorry we don't have more time, but African Americans have been written out of history for far too long. And they were written out of historical markers for far too long because historical markers were paid for by individuals. And so if you had the money and you had the wherewithal to write the history, you could get a historical marker. That's being corrected now because they have what are called undertold stories that they can find through other resources. Uh, but I am an idealist. And part of my problem as an idealist is that I would like to have people sit down and very logically talk through what monuments and memorials mean. And they do not last forever. They do not have a shelf life that lasts forever. And they were put up for reasons that were not necessarily dealing with history. They were put up for other reasons. People use history for political gain and other reasons, and we need to take that into account as well. I'm very excited that we're going back and reassessing monuments and memorials because I want our history to reflect as best we can our inclusive past. And as I mentioned, some people have just been left out of history. Women have been left out of history, and we need to correct that too. So I'm very excited. I wish the process would be, rather than vandalism, that it would be a logical, open forum where people could say, "Here's why that marker needs to be changed," or "Here's why that monument no longer resonates with people." Um, and it should not go forever. We're living in very exciting times where history again is being interpreted, and that's exciting.
Very good. So someone asks that as someone who's been an educator and historian for your whole life, is there any other field of learning that you hope to engage in retirement, or maybe there's a hidden talent you've got we just don't know? Is there another field you've mastered?
Yeah, I'd like to play the banjo at this point. No, uh, it's very interesting because I I'm going to take courses in geology, that's my next endeavor, because I've always been interested in the natural world as well. And so I'm making efforts now to get accepted to get into some courses for geology.
Did the mosasaur play a role in that decision?
Well, I was interested in geology when I went. This is how little advising I had in high school. When I went off to the University of Texas, I took geology and I loved it. But I thought, well, you can't make a living in geology. So I got into history.
All
There's a
right.
joke there for anybody in history, by the way. So
Sorry, I was reading the question and didn't give you your bum there. My bad. Um, I think this is a stump the band kind of question. So
okay.
I'll announce for you. I don't expect Dan to know the answer to this question. So if you do, I'll be impressed. I
Oh,
think the attendee is asking, where is the first ever state historical marker? Not your marker, but where's the first marker the state ever issued?
actually, that's known. If you
Okay.
talk about the markers that are put up along the highway today, the black markers, the aluminum markers,
Right.
the first one was at Camp Ford, which was a Confederate a prisoner of war camp near Tyler, Texas, in East Texas, Smith County. And it is a much larger marker than you see today. It had scroll work on it and all kinds of things. But that's the first marker. And it dates to 1959, if I remember right, not something like that.
All right, band stumper, try again. We nailed that one.
You got to give
All
me a
right.
harder than that.
There you go. So we just got a couple more and then we'll wrap up. And Dan, I want to let you know we really appreciate your time. For those of you that are still watching, I want to let you know as well, there are a handful of credit slides. And while, these are your typical things that are thanking people, if you've had a heartfelt moment with this session tonight, Dan has a slide of people that he specifically wants to thank, including at least one he's already mentioned in the audience. So stick around for that. We're not going to keep you here long. There's also the bibliography of his work that I mentioned. And if you have an interest in any of those things and you want to see it, I can send you that list. You can email us and request that. There's also, for those that play to the end, there's a fun little photo of Dan that I think you'll enjoy. And then we'll wrap this thing up. But the last couple of questions that I want to share, someone has just fired in with, what books would you recommend as a great overview of Texas history?
That may be beyond what we can talk about right now. There is a
Okay.
new one out, and it's called Big Wonderful Thing by Stephen Harrigan, which is now the cause celeb for Texas history, and I have not read it. It's 900 pages or something like that, and it's daunting. And I have started it, but I have not finished it, and that would be my next one to attack. And then any.
Let me say, sorry, Stephen was very kind to be part of our History at Night program this year. So he presented a program for some of our visitors in December and helped sold some books and talked about books. He also presented a keynote at the agency's Real Places conference in January. So Stephen's been a great supporter of ours and a great friend of ours. My joke, Dan, when he was here, is that I've read the pages that relate to the story I work with every day, which was about a third of the book. So that's kind of
Oh
where I'm
my.
at. Yeah.
Well, that's the
So
one
what
to
else?
tackle next.
What else?
Well, I would urge people to go to websites like the Texas A&M University Press website, University of Texas Press website, and look up Texas history titles. I don't specifically recommend sweeping histories anymore because I think everybody's got their own perspective and their own unique way of looking at history. And so they ought to find something that relates to that. There have been books that have been written in the past, sweeping histories of Texas, that I can't recommend, and I won't even acknowledge them with the title right now. But Gone to Texas by Mike Campbell might be a good one to try, a good sweeping history of Texas. And other than that, the Stephen Harrigan. I would also urge people to get involved locally. Every county has a county historical commission. Every region of the state has a historical association, like the East Texas Historical Association that I serve on the board of. And they have annual conferences. It's a good place to go and meet people who are writing history and talking about history and talking about books that influence them. And so it's exciting. There's a lot of stuff going on out there.
That's wonderful. And I'm pleased to hear you as a public historian encourage people to go deep, not wide. I think that is a trend in history to learn more about things you really like and find a story that you gravitate towards and learn a lot about it. Become an
Well,
expert.
and that's what I'm doing with conservation history now. I realized that I had a deficiency there, and so I'm going back and reading the classics, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Thoreau, Aldo Leopold. I'm trying to get back and get immersed in conservation history again. So.
Well, we have kept most of the audience, and you've all been troopers. Thanks for your participation. Like I said, either via chat or via email, if you want to share any thoughts or comments about the program, the quality of the program, which is all on us, my staff and I, has nothing to do with Dan. We know he's been entertaining tonight. I saved one question for kind of a collective for you, Dan, that's an end of career sort of question. What will you miss most
Whoa.
what will you miss most about being a
In a
professor
career?
and mentor to students? Well, you just retired. What are you going to
Okay.
miss about mentoring and being a professor?
Well, I will tell you, without a doubt, I absolutely loved teaching. I absolutely loved it. I loved going to class. I would get to class 15 minutes early so I could talk to the students and just get to know them as people. And one of the real sad things for me is that I had to end my teaching career at Texas State online. I would like to have been in person to hug the students and to shake their hands and to hear them laugh and cry and talk about history and in person, but we didn't get to do that, and it was just sort of hit the button and everything was gone. So I missed out on that. Teaching online is not necessarily teaching to me, and I like the give and take of in-person teaching.
Well, I would assume from what I know about you that those students who just finished this program, and of course some of them won't necessarily have graduated this year, but you would have been one of their last instructors. I'm sure they recognize, and if they don't, they soon will, that they're going to find one of their biggest fans as you monitor what they do as they go on from those programs. So that'll be a great ongoing
Well,
relationship.
I will tell you that all of my classes come with a lifetime guarantee, as I tell them, and it's my lifetime not there, so it's not that big a deal. But any time that I can help them, do research, find a source, find a place to be published, even join in with them on research. I'm looking forward to working with some of my former students from now on.
That's fabulous. All right, folks, thanks for being troopers and hanging in there. We're going to transition to these last couple of slides, and I'll give you some context to them as we go in. Here is the bibliography of Dan's work, and you can see links to the past there as the second listing. But the first listing goes back more than 20 years to a book called From Can See to Can't. And as he noted, you and your friends in the audience haven't bought enough of these, so they're all still available. And you can do a Google search or an Amazon search wherever you look for books online.
It becomes more important now that I'm retired.
Understood. I can hear that. So links to the past, the golf book that we started this program with tonight is available here in our gift shop, and we'd be happy to get one personalized for you. So as I said, reach out to us by phone. Our phone number will be in one of the upcoming slides. You also can email me directly, and I'll be happy to work with you to get Dan to personalize a book for you. As I mentioned, we're going to offer that guarantee through Sunday, and we're open for the next 3 days. So we're open all 3 days from roughly 9 to 5. And we'd be happy to talk to you about purchasing a book and getting Dan's signature for you. All right, what else have we got? Oh, look, here's our authors. So do you know where that photo was taken?
And this was taken at Star Ranch, which is outside of Pflugerville,
Okay.
outside of Hutto. And I want to pay special attention to Stan Graves. Stan is an architect, one of the best in the state, and a great friend. And we had fun working on the book. Unfortunately, in the middle of the research, his mother took very ill and eventually passed away. And she was a great local historian. So I want to remember her, Rachel Graves. And he's somebody that understands that you got to go to where the history happened, and it adds something to the dimension of your interest in history to go to the place. So we had fun working on the book, and not sure what his future endeavors are, but mine are going over to Texas State and working on that. So we
Very
probably
nice.
won't have collaboration, but
Can I presume that that's one of the courses featured in the book? I don't know that I recall that.
no, it's not. It
Okay,
just
okay.
happens to be one where we were photographed. And by the way, I might add, if you were good enough to see what's on my bookshelf, you can see I have 2 golf trophies. And Stan and I won those golf trophies, and both of them are for being dead ass last in the tournament. We came in last in the tournament 2 years in a row, and we're very proud of that. So
I've seen those trophies issued at the tournaments we manage, so nice on you. We'll have to get you out here if we do read our tournament at San Felipe. So these are the thanks and acknowledgments that Dan wanted us to include on his behalf, mostly co-authors, research assistants, and other colleagues. So I believe a handful of these folks were with us tonight, and we thank you for your time and your support of Dan, and certainly we thank him for his support of our site and the work we're doing here.
And I would say everybody's got to go to San Felipe. That's where it happened.
Excellent. Well, right now, just so people are aware, and obviously this is going to change as things reopen. We are open Wednesdays through Sundays. So if you're motivated to jump in the car because of this program tonight, please call us. We're doing structured tours on the hour most days, and we're closed on Mondays and Tuesdays so that we can better manage staff and manage this public health issue. So here are our thanks and acknowledgments. Mostly our production team and some of our colleagues. I've mentioned several of them already before. I also want to comment there at the bottom on the fact that this has been a great program for us. And so we appreciate the support of people that have been coming out. We imagine, to the question earlier about how the current crises and the virtual components are going to change this field going forward, we imagine that we'll be recording all of our future History at Night programs for some posterity online and some access in that format for people that can't come. We also presume that going forward, there'll be programs that we only do in a virtual capacity, as well as programs that we do in public. That's part of our new reality. And to Dan's point about being an idealist, I think we all see this as an opportunity. We want to find a way to make this work, not just for us, but for our visitors and supporters across the state of Texas.
There's plenty of history to talk about.
There you go. So here's the contact information for those of you that might need it. You can email me directly. Certainly feel free to call us as well. If you call the main number, the way to get to our visitor center, to our retail space, the store here, is to press 1 when you hear my voice on the auto tell answerer. So when the robot comes up, press 1 or press 0, and that'll take you to our store. And we'll be happy to talk to you about the offerings and let you know what else you might can shop with if golf's not your thing. Dan, it's been a privilege, as always.
Been an
Thank you
honor
for
for me.
taking time with us tonight, and really excited that you've got some new adventures still ahead of you, and we look forward to these future books. I can only imagine we'll get a chance to have a History at Night program featuring you in the future that will be here and in person. So we look forward to that
That'd be
as
great
well.
fun.
There you go. Thank you
Take care,
all.
my friend.
I appreciate it, Dan. Take care. And I believe